Hello and welcome to this webinar, or Pro Tools Tech Talk as we're calling it. So my name is Dave Tyler and I'm joined by Daniel Lovell here. There we go. So Dan and I are going to take you through the new hybrid engine for HDX. So before we get down to that, just a couple of bits of housekeeping. So we would recommend that you're using gallery view. It's only going to be Dan and I presenting, but with gallery view, you should be able to see the two of us on screen. We'll be sort of interacting and so on. You can choose to hide any non-video participants so that you're only seeing the two of us, because we have a bunch of other people on the webinar who are standing by to answer questions. So with that in mind, if you are on the Zoom and you want to ask questions, then we're using the Q&A function. So the Q&A, that will put questions into the queue. We've got Gil and Jeff online on hand to answer questions, and they can either take them and answer themselves, or we can sort of push some and answer them live. We've also got a bunch of people from our team from around the world who are monitoring social media platforms. So we're streaming on Facebook, on the Pro Tools and the Avid Facebook channels, on YouTube, on LinkedIn. So if you're on any of those platforms, then there will be someone from Avid on there who'll be monitoring. So if you want to drop any questions, then we can also pass those through to the Zoom and then answer them live as well if necessary. So without further ado, this is the running order, how this is gonna go. We're going to talk a little bit, start off with a bit of history about the history of DSP processing and Avid's part in it. Discuss a little bit of why we need DSP for audio. We'll move on to how the HDX system specifically works today, and that will lead us on to introducing the hybrid engine itself, which we will show you in action in Pro Tools, and then we'll sort of finish off with a bit of a comparison between the current way of working with HDX and the new HDX hybrid engine workflow. So history, actually, this is as Dan pointed out to me just a minute ago, it's Pro Tools 30th anniversary or 30th birthday. So I think there's a few posts out there on social media, and hopefully there'll be some stuff coming from Avid too. But we've been doing this a little while, and back in the early days of Pro Tools, really your CPU was not able to handle audio processing. It could barely sort of do the screen redraws. So DSP acceleration was absolutely a requirement of those systems, and that's one thing where Pro Tools really sort of grew very quickly, was providing a professional digital audio platform based on an off-the-shelf CPU. And of course, as CPUs became more powerful, then more and more of that audio processing could be handled by the host. So there sort of came a tipping point where, sort of the host CPU in terms of power became more powerful than those DSP cards that were doing the processing before, to the point where, I mean, if you look at the raw power of like a fully kitted out Mac Pro, I mean, there's crazy amounts of native power that far surpasses anything that you can get on dedicated audio DSPs, which begs the question, why do we still need DSP-based systems? And I think actually this diagram is actually a really great illustration of the sort of the balancing act between sort of the native and the DSP side of things. So what the native processor does is give you huge amounts of raw power. It can give you low latency, but it's at the expense of that power, because in order to get low latency, you have to set a low buffer size, which means you don't have the resources available to sort of run big mixers and plugins and so on. So really, that power, that raw power, that's what the native CPU excels at. But where HDX has always been, has really had the advantage, is two things. One is determinism, so that's how predictable the system is. So if you're running an HDX2, for example, regardless of the model of computer, you know if you have a session which is running on an HDX2 system using the DSP power, if you open it up the next day on a different HDX2 system, it will open up in exactly the same way. So that's not always true of a CPU. So with CPUs, there are always going to be kind of small differences. CPU may be running different applications in the background, and certainly if you're moving from one CPU to another, they're never set up in exactly the same way. So HDX has always given us that determinism, but also given us guaranteed low latency. So that's throughout the entire system. Those DSP chips are dedicated to the task of processing audio, and that's just what they do. And they're not having to do any other tasks. Therefore, that latency, that low latency, is there at all times when you're working with the HDX card. So that's really why we still have DSP systems, because they still have a part to play. With HDX today, the HDX card is actually being asked to do a lot of stuff. So it's running the mixer. That's a really big sort of part of the job of the HDX card, running your mixer, but also doing your plug-in processing. There's an FPGA on the HDX card which handles running the voices and so on. You've got, you can run both AX native and DSP plugins, and they can coexist. But fundamentally, it's based around running the mixer on the DSP. And an additional aspect of the HDX card is that you have 64 channels of Digilink, so it also gives you the I/O, the connection to the outside world. So there's a lot of things which are hanging off, sort of one single card, and that's one thing that the hybrid engine does, is to start to sort of break these things apart and use other aspects of our system to its own strengths, and that's what we'll kind of discuss as to how the hybrid engine works. So before we do that, I'm going to divert just for a minute onto a different but related topic, something I've mentioned already, and that's something called voices. So I think it's important before we move on, because we will be discussing voices and tracks and numbers and so on. I think it's important to understand what we mean by that. So in a Pro Tools system, we use the terminology of a voice, which is used to stream the audio from disk into our mixer. So a single voice is required for every audio path. So it's a mono path, one voice, stereo path, 2, 5.16 voices, and so on. And in the Pro Tools world, it's an audio track that's used to play back that audio from disk. So as I say, an audio track, a stereo audio track, will be using 2 voices. A 5.1 audio track will be using 6 voices, and so on. So that's important to bear that in mind, that tracks and voices are not exactly the same thing. A mono audio track, as I say, it's 1 voice, but a single stereo audio track is 2 voices. Another important concept is that mixer paths. So once you start building a mixer on an HDX card, building a DSP mixer, those paths don't require more voices. So therefore, any auxiliary inputs that you're using don't use up your voice count or your visible voice count. So that's an important point when we're talking about tracks and voices and all these numbers, is to ensure that we have a clear understanding of which types of tracks in Pro Tools are using voices and which are not. So the way the terminology we use for Pro Tools Ultimate, is we count voices, and Pro Tools Ultimate as it is today we have 2 voice limits. There's the voice limit you have when you're working with an HDX system, and the voice limit you have when you're working with native hardware. So for an HDX system, you have 256 voices per card, up to a maximum of HDX3, so it's 768 voices. And if you're running natively, then you have 384 voices. An important caveat with these voice counts is that they halve as you double the sample rate. Okay, so as I say, we'll And you'll understand why that's important as we move on and talk more about how the hybrid engine works. So, as I say, that kind of sets the scene for some of the things we're going to be talking about more in a moment. So let's come back to the HDX card, talk about some of the basics of its operation and possibly where there are some limitations in the way that it's being used today. So first of all, as I said, the mixer on an HDX system is hosted on the DSP chips on the card. Now that's fine if you're working on sort of medium-sized mixers, stereo mixers. But as soon as you start working on large mixers, and especially multi-channel mixers, especially going from 7.1 and going up to Dolby Atmos, you'll find that your DSP chips are being used just to run the mixer. And it's quite possible to end up using all your DSP power that's available to your new HDX cards, using all up on the mixer and actually leaving very little behind for DSP plugin processing. So that's definitely one thing that our high-end post customers bump up against. The second thing is that voice handling is done by the FPGA on the card. So that 256 voices per card is a hardware limit based on the function of that FPGA. So in HDX world, so AX DSP plugins are hosted on those DSP chips on the card, and AX native plugins are hosted on the CPU. And if you're mixing and matching native and DSP plugins, then there are certain things you have to bear in mind when you're using an HDX system. And this is something which sort of seasoned HDX users, that's just they totally used to it. That's just the way that it works. Whereas if you're not sort of so clued up on some of these things and some of the ways that the HDX card actually works, then you can sort of quickly get yourself into trouble. So to illustrate what I mean, there's a very simple diagram showing the path of an audio track from disk. Obviously, it goes through the CPU because the disk is attached to your computer, so the CPU has to handle that. Then pass through to the HDX card, which is where our mixer resides, and then out from there to our I/O. So if you put a native plugin before a DSP plugin on an audio track, then it doesn't use any additional voices. There's no issue there because the audio's come off disk, it's gone onto the CPU, to the HDX card, and so on. However, if you put a native plugin after a DSP plugin, then it needs an additional voice to get it from the HDX card back to the CPU to be processed, and obviously back to the HDX card again. And in the same way, putting a native plugin on any auxiliary track or master fader will use additional voices, which makes sense if you think about it, because an aux track or a master fader, they're running on the HDX card. So if you put a native plugin on those, then it's going to have to hop to the CPU and then back to your HDX system. So with our older DSP-based systems, that would sort of start to steal your usable voices. But with HDX, we actually sort of built in some hidden voices to facilitate those workflows without impacting the voice count. But there's only 64 available, so it's quite possible in a complex mix to actually run out of that and start eating into your usable voices. So obviously that can be an issue. The other thing to bear in mind is that these hops add a lot of latency, so double the hardware buffer size. So you end up with a very latent mix if you're not careful, particularly if you're using lots of native processing, if you're using lots of VIs and this kind of thing. It's actually can be quite a problem with an HDX system, and you end up with a lot of latency within your system itself. So this point, I'm going to hand over to Dan, and he is going to explain how the hybrid engine solves all of our problems.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Kia ora, konnichiwa, ohayo, and I'm happy to have this session actually in a time that crosses over in the APAC region, which is where I'm based. So good morning to everyone in the APAC region. But yeah, thanks very much, Dave, for that outline. I think it's really crucial to see how the DSP has worked up until now so that we can see where we're going and why we're retaining the parts of it that work really well for what they're really good at doing. So let's dive into the hybrid engine. Let me share my screen, that would help. All right, there we go. So yes, the hybrid engine concept and technology was introduced with Pro Tools Carbon. We're going to take some time to explain the ins and outs of how the hybrid engine works, but actually it's pretty straightforward. The mixer runs on the CPU, and as required, we move selected tracks over to the DSP along with all of their processing. And given that the HDX card uses the same DSP and essentially the same Pro Tools mix engine, it makes absolute sense to bring that technology to the HDX card. So some of you might have seen how this technology works along with Pro Tools Carbon, but let's just have a quick review of some of the ways that it works. So if we look at this example here, we're running currently, as you can see, all of the plugins, mixers, busing is running natively, and that output is going directly out to our hardware. But let's say we needed a track to be in low latency, or to say in another way, maybe as little delay from input to output as possible. Well, what we do is we just click on the DSP mode button, and that moves that track and all of its processing over to the DSP on the HDX card. Additionally, to maintain the optimized path for low latency, all the tracks that are downstream from that plugin also move over to the DSP. So we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. We've enabled a track in DSP mode, and all of the tracks after this also move to the DSP mode to have that low latency path all the way through to the outputs. The great thing is, however, all of the other tracks are still running in the native engine, on the native mixer, and that gives you all the power that we talked about that's available on modern CPUs. So it's interesting to think about it in that many of the processes that we do in audio now actually suit running on something like a native mixer. When we think about things like virtual instruments, some reverbs, things like noise reduction, those kind of processes, generally there isn't a DSP version, and they're not the kind of processing that works particularly well on DSP. So those kind of processing makes sense to leave in the native domain. But when we need to record a live input, or perhaps a hardware insert, or something that we want to run at extremely low latency, or as I said before, as little delay from the time it's input to the system to the output of the system, this is how we can combine these two features. So there's a lot of users out there who've spent a lot of time on HDX, and you will know that when you build a session, that actually your session, as we mentioned earlier, depending on your busing, because the mixer in HDX Classic as we're calling it, and it's great to have a name because it makes it easier to talk about, but that when you build a mixer, a very complex mixer can actually take a huge part of your available DSP and actually not leave as much as you might like for your plugin processing. So we're going to have a look at this, how this affects sessions. So we can see an example here that's actually combining a couple of the issues that we talked about earlier, such as voice count and hosting the mixer on the DSP, and then going between the native and DSP domain for plugins. We can see here that in this session, there is almost all three HDX cards are being fully used, and something like 405 out of the 512 voices available are already being used. And a lot of that is not actually because they're audio playback tracks or voices or streams from disk. It's because of jumps between DSP plugins and native plugins. So if we look at what that will look like on the HDX hybrid engine, we can see that the CPU host load is actually not significantly more. And we've significantly reduced the amount of voices we're using because we're not making those unnecessary jumps, because the mixes based in the native domain, we're only putting it in the DSP domain when we need it for that low latency path. So in the item you can see on the right there has some load balancing. So what I mean by load balancing is some of the tracks have been placed into DSP mode just to make it a little bit easier to for the CPU to play back. And as you can see, there's actually still quite a lot of room for this session on the HDX hybrid engine to expand, to grow larger. Whereas we can see in the HDX classic mode, there is that system is almost completely full, near its physical limit. And that's what we talked about earlier on. It's a physical limitation, and that physical limitation in the example on the left has almost completely been used up. So again, just some review. Some of you might be familiar with some of these from the Carbon launch, but again, it's really, really simple. Basically, we have these different modes in the mixer which appear in the edit and mix window, and we'll have a look at that in a Pro Tools session coming up shortly. But we have native mode, which is the gray icon there, and that essentially means that the track is playing back natively using the CPU and is being basically streamed directly out of your hardware. The bright green means that someone has enabled DSP mode on purpose for that low latency path. And that gives us all the advantages we've talked about and we know about with DSP, a super low latency from input to output, because DSP is great at doing one thing in a very short time. Whereas, as you mentioned, the CPU is good at doing a lot of things, but that generally leads to longer latencies. So a track that's in DSP mode is moved over to the HDX DSP chips. And the HDX DSP chips, there's 18 of them in there. And because you can expand the system with multiple HDX cards, you potentially have more DSP available. Now, when you're in DSP mode, only DSP plugins can be active, which I guess makes sense. But it's just to maintain that low latency path with as little management as possible, because as HDX users now will know, sometimes you have to be a little bit careful about how you make a session to make sure that you keep the system running low latency and don't add too many of those DSP to native hops. You can actually exceed the capability of the delay compensation by doing that too many times. So this makes it a lot easier to work through. What it does mean is that the native plugins, or the plugins that don't have a DSP equivalent, will be bypassed. And similarly, when we're in native mode, native plugins run on that track. And I guess that's pretty straightforward. Suffice to say that all plugins that are available in DSP also have a native equivalent. So that's not going to be an issue that way around. And just the other mode that's available there, we've seen the light green. The dark green is a track that's automatically been put into DSP mode because it's downstream from the DSP enabled mode enabled track. But there is another mode that we have, which is DSP mode safe. What this does is it means that a track won't go into DSP mode automatically. And there's a couple of use cases for this. I'm going to show that really quickly when we jump into Pro Tools. But suffice to say, there's things like delays and reverbs that may not matter if there's a slight amount of latency between the input and that effect send getting to that plugin. If it's something like a reverb that's just to give you an environment while you're recording, those kind of cases can also be used if your favorite reverb plugin, for example, doesn't have a DSP version. So what does this mean? Now, I think this number is really important because the hybrid engine doesn't have the physical limitations of the HDX card. The voice count is now increased to 2048, and this is a very significant increase from the maximum of 768 on an HDX3 system. And additionally, as Dave mentioned earlier, that this is at all sample rates. So just to be clear, if you had one HDX card, you have 256 voices. But if you went up to 192K, you would only have 64 voices. However, with the hybrid engine, you have that voice count all the way through. To make sure that everyone can take full advantage of this new voice count, the audio track count has been increased to 2048. But at this point, I just wanted to just make something clear about Pro Tools. Perhaps in the way that we talk about voices and tracks, because at Avid and with Pro Tools, we've always had this concept of DSP working alongside the software. But this is 2048 or whatever number of audio tracks you have available in your Pro Tools systems now. But some people get the impression that that's quite limiting. However, the audio track count, the audio tracks that are capable of playback and record, and some operations like jumps between DSP and native use voices. But a lot of the other track count types don't, like MIDI tracks, instrument tracks, auxiliaries, and things like that. So it's actually whatever your track count is now, or your audio voice count or audio track count, plus the other kinds of tracks. So this is, in this case, we could say I've got 2048 mono audio tracks, but also I can have 512 auxiliaries and so on, provided that your CPU is actually capable of playing that back. So you can build enormous sessions. And I think, as we've seen recently in post-production and music, the requirement for larger track types, more complicated mixes has just increased in an exponential way. So to add this extra functionality and to really free up the Pro Tools system to operate the best that it can in this situation makes a lot of sense. Use the CPU for what the CPU is great at, and then use the DSP for what the DSP is great at. So at this point, before I jump into looking in Pro Tools, is there anything we want to catch up on there at all, Dave?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions come in. So we've got one which is time slots don't show in hybrid mode. Are they no longer a thing? And essentially, no, they're not, because your mixer is running on the host CPU. Now, when we're putting tracks to DSP mode, they are running on the HDX card. But really, I mean, there's the time slots that you have available, that you're never going to run out of them. And I think that was the thing when we had old HD systems. Actually, sort of time slots was something you did need to keep an eye on, because it was possible to run out. But with HDX, we've never even got close. So to be honest with you, once, as I say, you've got the mixer is mostly running on the native CPU anyway. So the elements of the mix which are running on the HDX card are really using very few time slots. So they do exist, but there's no real need to count them. Yeah. Another one we had, I think just a bit earlier on, was Yeah, I think this is maybe a good one to just to discuss briefly, which is in the when we showed that example, the animation where you're just moving a few tracks to DSP and then leaving other tracks on the native. And then the question was, doesn't this affect the overall mix? And the simple answer is no. And that's because of the magic of the AX plugin platform. The AX native and the AX DSP plugins are processed in exactly the same way. They sound exactly the same. So therefore you can, you can jump plug in, you can, move things between the native and the DSP and it all sounds the same. And there's some really obviously clever stuff going on under the hood. The cool thing for you as a user, you just press that green button, boom, off it goes, and it will sound identical. So actually, no, there's no problem with that, and the mix won't change.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. As we've been discussing this with people, there is this idea that people are so used to doing it the way that they have in the past and really thinking about that DSP processing or somehow that the DSP is better. Sure, it provides a certain functionality of that low latency, but as you said, there's absolute sonic parity between the DSP and the native versions on our current platform. So the benefits are really, while we're explaining it in detail, you just trust the system,
Mm.
that you run things in native, and when you require that low latency path for whatever reason, a narrator, a musician, a track that you're monitoring in real time, then that's when you use that DSP mode. So it becomes significantly more flexible, but actually a lot more simple to operate.
Yeah, and I think that's what we want to sort of show next. I wonder if maybe
Yeah,
there's one more question here. Maybe we just can answer this
sure.
briefly, and that's that an HDX card has 18 chips, um, and obviously a Carbon unit has 8 HDX
That's right.
DSP
Yeah.
chips. So one of the, and we talked about this already, but the hybrid engine on Carbon works exactly the same way as it does on the HDX card. The difference is that with Carbon, that those chips are built into the interface, and it's a really kind of straightforward, all-in-one box solution. HDX has always been, something modular. You can add cards. You choose which interfaces you want to use, and so on. So essentially, that those differences will remain. Whether we do something with an interface that has the same kind of DSP count as an HDX card, I think is it's not something that we are sort of talking about at the moment. But as I say, I think it's worth pointing out that Carbon actually has it's designed for a certain function. Actually, it has plenty of HDX processing power to do the job it's designed to do, which is to track a band. But if you want more DSP power for offloading processing or for making bigger mixes, that's where HDX comes in. So I think with all of that, we should probably actually
Yeah.
look at how it appears in Pro Tools.
Yep, let's do that. So I've got a really super Pro Tool session here. Hopefully you can see that just fine. Now, this entire time I've been talking to you through Pro Tools. So we're just going to have a look at a couple of the buttons and what they do. Now, I've got the system usage window open to show that right now, although my playback engine is HDX, I'm not actually using any DSP right now. So what happens when I put a track into DSP mode? Well, simply I click this button right here. I can zoom a little bit just so we can see it a little more clearly. Right there. And it will move this track and its associated plugins and the downstream paths also to DSP. So let's do that. So we now move those tracks into the DSP mode, and we can see that Pro Tools is letting us know that it's moved some downstream tracks and plugins into DSP to preserve the low latency path. And already we can see that I have some great plugins here, some DSP plugins, both Avid and some other third-party plugins that have both native and DSP modes versions available. And those plugins automatically go into DSP mode, and now they live on the DSP to give you that super low latency path. But I think what's been really, really tough for us in our group, usually we're out in the world, we're at trade shows, we're talking to dealers, we're going to music shops, and we're able to show almost instantaneously the benefit of hybrid engine on both carbon and also with the HDX. And it's a little bit hard to really describe what that's like. So I'm going to try and show you it through Pro Tools. So we're listening to my voice here, and this one's in DSP mode. Now I actually have the same microphone patched into Pro Tools, but in a track that's in native mode. Now I'm going to unmute this, and just imagine for a second that the DSP mode is as close as it can be to almost no latency, or very small amount of latency. However, the native track is going through all the processing, and I'm going to play them together, and I think you'll hear that they are it's quite disconcerting to hear both of these together. And if you were trying to do this while you're recording a voiceover or doing something else, singing, and had that much latency, when I'm just doing some fairly basic processing, you can imagine that that doesn't feel good as a performer. It doesn't. It isn't nice when you're doing narration to have that kind of latency there. So just to have another look at it, let's just do a quick record of the same outputs of these tracks. Excuse me while I unmute it and you hear this this latent sound again. But we're going to have a look at just how different they are. So I'm just going to go into record here and talk a little bit. Hello, and here we go. Let's do a little transient sound. So now I'm going to mute that again because I'm sure it's quite disconcerting, as it would be for anyone that doesn't have this kind of DSP acceleration in their system, whether it's a carbon or an HDX type system. If anyone's been in Pro Tools for years, as I know many of us have, that kind of difference in arrival time of the audio is really disconcerting. And all I've done is I've recorded the output of the DSP enabled track and recorded the output of the track going through the native mixer. So again, the native mixer is fantastic at doing complex things like virtual instruments and lots of really deep processing, but it's not so great at delivering things extremely quickly in real time. And I think this just gives you a very visual idea of what that looks like. And just as another example, I've got another Pro Tools system with me, and I'm just going to play a drum loop, and we're going to switch these tracks a little bit between native and DSP. Once again, just to give you a really real world example of if I was trying to play drums to this, if I was trying to do something rhythmic along with this, it would be extremely difficult. So I'm going to start out with just one track here. Let me get my other Pro Tools system running. Right. Hold on a second. There we go. So this track and this other track are both currently running natively. When we mute them and unmute them, they run perfectly in time, as you'd expect. So let's drop one of them into DSP mode. So now we can hear that track, that sort of instrument with a rhythmic quality to it. Now if we listen to that against the native version, we've almost got a scenario where there's a significant amount of delay. And if you were trying to play an instrument or play drums or anything like that with that kind of latency, I think you're going to find it really difficult. once we put the other track in DSP mode, both of them are once again perfectly in time. As I say, this is just my attempt to show something that we would love to show in person all over the place at the moment.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely. It's, as you say,
yeah,
it's as tricky for us to do that. But I think, yeah, I mean, the idea, as you say, is that anyone who's performing, it's that sound that you're getting back to your headphones, compared to what you're actually performing, and that's really where this is. This is really where where the power of the hybrid engine comes in, because it's all about this sort of best of both worlds. And so, shall I move on? I've got another sort of example to show. So if I grab the screen share back again,
please do.
And
I think the great thing is that one thing that we've talked about with when we launched Pro Tools Carbon, but it's also the same for HDX's HDX hybrid engine, is that this is a really portable and transferable system. The same session that you build on a laptop and can listen to anywhere, when you pair that with a Carbon or an HDX system, the power is, you have that DSP on demand for low latency workflows. But without that system, you can still hear, within the limitations of the quality of your I/O, of course, but you can hear exactly the same mix, exactly the same way, across a completely flexible set of systems.
yeah,
just a really quick.
Yeah,
I can see your screen. It looks. Oh no, it looks okay. It was a touch bright, but it's okay now. Yeah. All right.
So yes, I've been playing around with my colors and so on. Yes, so this is just, I guess, another example of how you can use the hybrid engine, particularly I think in the context of HDX workflows where you've got more DSPs to play with than you have perhaps on a Carbon system. So we've got a session which is a tried and tested demo session we've had for many years, Agent MX0. And it's a decent sized post-production session. So we've got a bunch of dialogue tracks. We've got all the music split out, including virtual instruments and so on. Then we've got some effects, backgrounds, Foley, and so on. And then down to my sort of my stems and print tracks at the bottom here. So as I say, it's a medium-sized sort of post-production session. It's only 5.1, so it's using a decent amount of sort of mixer power if it were running on an HDX card. So what I've done, if I just move sort of back up the session a little bit, so all of the tracks which are playing back, everything is in native mode, and you can see this is from the color here. This is native mode. It's running. My plugins are in native mode. But what I've done is I've made use of the DSP power that I have available to me to put my stems and print tracks into DSP mode. So if I just open up system usage, so you can see I'm using some of my DSP power for the mixer because there's a certain amount of routing going on, but also some of it to run my mastering chain of plugins, just some EQs, limiters, and so on in there. So I'm sort of, I'm using just over half of the power of that HDX card, just to allow me to, first of all, because these are print tracks, then I can sort of monitor them back again with a low latency. If I run the output of these tracks back through Matrix, for example, and I could monitor those, and those would be low latency, so I'd be able to kind of switch between playback and sort of an input, and wouldn't hear any latency, any delay. But also it enables us to do a little bit of what Dan's already referred to as load balancing. So, I'm using, my CPU's not really being taxed very much. I'm running, sort of a medium power computer. So it's a Mac Mini i7, so decent spec. But it's not really taxing the CPU. But I'm just using the DSP power that's available to me to run some aspects of my session. So, this is what the hybrid engine does, is it gives you this flexibility in terms of how you use it. You can use it for tracking, for low latency. You can use it for offloading some of your plugin processing and so on. It's a very flexible way of working. And I think with that, what we're going to do is sort of move on to just back to some slides and just talk a little bit about the hybrid engine and the classic, what we're calling the classic engine, and some of the differences between the two of them, and then we'll so we can compare them. So what does that classic HDX give us? It gives us that sort of predictable performance that we talked about at the beginning, but it's limited by the card, and that's the critical thing. I think in sort of maybe when we first introduced HDX, mixers weren't as big. We didn't have sort of Dolby Atmos sessions, and sessions have just grown exponentially over the years. People running these gigantic sessions, and really sort of the card is limiting that performance. Also, we've got our voicing, which we talked about, is managed by the card, so that's a limiting factor. Possibly native processing in the mixer, again, consuming voices, so that's sort of another limiting factor. Maybe something to bear in mind is that actually an advantage of the classic engine is that DSP and native plugins can coexist, but again within some limitations, as we've discussed earlier on. And as I said, the multi-channel mixing particularly really can sort of eat up your DSP, so you end up having no DSP left for plugin processing at all. But on the plus side, as I said, when you're running an HDX system, then if you open it up the next day, it always restores it identically. It will play back in exactly the same way, because it's not sort of limited by other things that are going on in the CPU. So when we come to the hybrid engine, your performance does vary more based on the CPU. Some of our very lucky beta testers have these incredible souped up Mac Pros, and they can just run the most insane sessions. On my humble Mac Mini, it struggles a bit if I try and run a couple of thousand tracks. But still, with these powerful CPUs, we can get much more out of them, than we've ever been able to do. But the moving to the host CPU does enable us to give us this massive voice track increase, because we're not limited by the hardware anymore. We've got that native mixer giving us lots of flexibility. We've got the latency, the low latency, available to us on the DSP chips. And of course, we've got, we've bypassed those issues that we had with the classic HDX system, where if you're using voices or using plugins in the wrong way, then you're using up voices and you're adding latency to your system, and that doesn't happen with the hybrid engine. So the native mixer is very efficient. It scales as you need it, and then our DSP is available to us to do load balancing, as we discussed. But the cool thing about this, though, is that if you've got an HDX system, you can just tick and untick the hybrid engine box and just use it in the way that that makes sense for you. And so I think one last point to discuss would be, maybe there are times when you do want to use classic HDX, and this kind of speaks to some things from the previous slide, and these are just some ideas. This is not an exhausting list, but say for example you're in a music studio, you're running a complex tracking session with a band. That you're not going to run out of mixer power, because you're tracking a band, you're not doing lots of routing, but maybe you're running loads of headphone mixers, and you want to make sure that everything is like on the low latency path. And you could run the hybrid engine and just put all tracks into DSP mode, but why not just turn the hybrid engine off and just use the HDX card in the classic sort of classic mode, so everything's running on the DSP. So that's definitely something that you might want to do. If you're running on a very old CPU, you might prefer that predictability that we talked about of using the HDX engine within the limitations we've discussed. And then similar to the first one, if you're running a separate Pro Tools recorder, you're not taxing the mixer. It's a very simple routing session. You've got no plugins, but you want that immediacy, you want that low latency. And therefore you might just want to run that in classic HDX mode. So as I say, those are just a couple of examples of, when you might actually want to be using the classic HDX mode. But as I said already, the beauty here is that you can choose, you've got the option to turn it off and turn it on.
Exactly.
So with that, I think we're going to move into some Q&A. And I think, Dan, before we did that, we had a couple of preemptive points to make. So I think we were going to talk about...
Yes. So one thing, and the question's definitely come up, and I think it's been answered on a couple of the forums already, is when is this going to be available? And a good one that we haven't really touched on, who is it going to be available to? The public announcement is that it's sometime in June. The specific date will be informed later. But who is able to get it? Basically anybody that's on a current subscription or on an update and support plan that's current. When this release comes out, this hybrid engine technology will be available to you. There is a number of other features within this upcoming planned release, and we are going to have another webinar at a later date to talk through some of the other things that are planned for the release. But we really wanted to concentrate on the hybrid engine today, is that's just it requires a little bit of thinking and a little bit of change in thinking about how we think about HDX, how we think about Pro Tools, and how we think about using our systems in a flexible and powerful way. And the other one that is, a great one is, where are we with Big Sur and M1 chips? Now, of course, again, this is not what this session's about, but we are compatible on Big Sur on Intel. And as we've said publicly now, we are working on getting M1 initial compatibility out as soon as we possibly can. But please keep an eye on that. We know it's incredibly important to a lot of people, and all I can say is that we are working on it very actively, and we will see the beginning of the phased approach to that starting relatively soon.
Yep. So I guess from there's some good questions coming. So I'm going to dive into one, because I've been reading it while you've been talking, and then if you can do the same. So. Sure. There was a question from Luke Howard. Said, can tracks go into DSP mode automatically when placed in input or record? And the answer is yes. And that's one of the kind of the beauties of the design of this system, is that you don't really, you don't have to think about too much. You want to record somebody, you hit the record button or record ready, and the track goes into DSP mode. Yeah. And then there was a follow. Another half of this was, when a track is not in DSP mode, is the monitoring latency determined by the buffer size in the playback engine? That's a really important point. So when you have a track in DSP mode, the monitoring latency, because it's no longer on the native mixer, it's on the DSP mixer. So the monitoring latency is not it has no relation to the buffer size. You could be running 1024 buffer size. Yeah. And you have sub 1 millisecond latency when you're monitoring, because any track that's in DSP mode is going directly between sort of the DSP chips and your I/O, and not going to the CPU. So that's it's a good question, and a really important point, that you're disconnecting your monitoring latency from your hardware buffer size. That's a really, really key one.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it. I've got the screen open if we want to have a look at it, but the question about automatically enabling the tracks on input and record, there is an option to do that within the preferences, and that's been available with Carbon as well. So again, we've given a lot of information, but it's sort of almost like, don't overthink it too much. It's use the native for what it's good for, and then use the DSP for what it's good for, which is that super low latency. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the low latency mode, or the DSP mode, is almost spookily low latency. In my experience, having done a little bit of voiceover here and there over the years, when you put it in DSP mode, I actually have to turn up my headphones because it's very difficult. Even before, there's a small amount of latency, but now it's so low latency, and I've noticed this, that I actually have to monitor slightly louder on my headphones because that path is so low latency that it's almost like I'm just hearing my own voice again, if you see what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah, definitely.
And so that's one thing. And then I think maybe one of the other guys answered already, but is there uh yeah, so sorry, just one of the guys noted. So when the track's not in DSP mode and paste and input record, there is a enabled DSP mode when hardware inputs are record enabled or input enabled. There is an option, a preference for that to be clear. And then
I
there
think
was
there's,
another one.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think this is an interesting one, actually, just as a good discussion point based on what we were talking about. And someone says, if I'm not having any issues with my 3-card HDX system on a trash can Mac, with a bunch of I/O, is there still an advantage to the hybrid engine? And I think the answer to that really is it's up to you to decide. And I think hopefully what we've tried to show is that you have the choice. It's a checkbox, and when this version of Pro Tools comes out, essentially you've got the ability to turn it on and try it out. And you may find for you that it doesn't have an advantage. But what I will say is that I think without exception, everybody who's tried it doesn't ever turn it off once they've enabled it. I think that's probably true to say.
And there's a technical aspect we didn't really touch on in this presentation, but because of the way that the native mixer streams into the hardware, you actually, one advantage, a technical advantage, is that you can have significantly lower overall system delay when you're running everything in native mode, even through the through the HDX card. And another one that's just a little bit own personal experience, but you might think, well, if everything's running in the native mixer, is it that much more efficient than just running some sort of core audio device? And in my experience, those low-level HDX card drivers make a huge difference. That the same session, I make quite a few sessions with a lot of virtual instruments, and of course they don't have DSP alternatives, but even in that case, running on the HDX system in hybrid mode seems to be more efficient than running on a core audio device in comparison. It's one of those things. Each session and different kind of plugin is going to be slightly different, but in my experience, it's made quite a significant difference by having that very deep and low latency driver path to the hardware, and not running through the extra layer of OS calculations.
Cool. I think Gil is typing an answer, but I did see a question has come in about what determines when a track goes to the automatic DSP mode. And I think, so I mean, the simple answer to that is if a track is feeding into another track, so anything downstream, whether that's going, an output through busing through to another track, or going through to another track via a send, anything which is downstream will automatically inherit DSP mode. And that's really important because it's required for that low latency path. So and the only exception to that, which Dan mentioned, is that if you have a time-based effect, like a delay or a reverb, you can sort of choose to manually override that automatic DSP mode. And the reason that you can do that is because it's a delay-based effect anyway. So it doesn't really, affect your. It doesn't matter if it's late because, say, the whole effect is based on it being late. So, yeah, I think hopefully that answers the question. But with and again, I think maybe it's worth coming back and saying that this workflow is exactly the same workflow that we have in Carbon, and certainly would encourage anyone who's wants to sort of dig more into hybrid engine for both Carbon and HDX. We've done a bunch of videos which can be found on our YouTube channel to hopefully sort of help to kind of demystify it, because actually once you've used it yourself, it's really, really simple. You just press a button and off you go.
Exactly.
So yeah. We've got any more questions coming in from anywhere? Just think, are there any that we haven't missed, Dan? Have you?
I'm keeping an eye. We look like we've got through most of them. Some of the team's been answering some questions there. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that more information and some frequently asked questions are available, and I'll just share my screen just for a tick.
Yeah.
Are available at avid.com. So we have a landing page which tells you kind of many of the things we've gone over today, but also a frequently asked questions page as well, just to get a little bit more information about what is available with this hybrid engine. So if you've got some more questions, please check it out there.
Actually, can you just scroll to the top of that page?
This one here?
Yeah, because I think actually...
Oh, yeah, that's a good one, yeah.
There's a little product that we brought out. In fact, there's two products that came out at the same time at the beginning of last year, which seems like an awfully long time ago now. But back when we were at NAMM, we launched the Matrix Studio and the Thunderbolt 3 chassis. So the Thunderbolt 3 chassis, I've actually got one set up in my system, and it's so you've got space for an HDX card and a Mac Mini and a nice kind of rack mount. And it's a perfect, setup for a hybrid engine system. An HDX One card, a Matrix Studio. You've got a really, fantastic compact rig for, doing post. Anything, up to Dolby Atmos if you want to, in a very sort of compact rig. And if you add it onto that, the new SyncX peripheral to give you the frame edge alignment, you've got a really powerful system. In a very compact footprint. So as I say, I think it's worth kind of mentioning that setup as well.
And I guess the other thing is, there's a lot of customers that have been with Avid for a long time, and I think what's really great about this particular thing is that it's going to be available to everyone who's up to date or on a subscription plan when this version of software is released, and it's going to give everyone a lot more flexibility and functionality with the hardware that they already had. Just like the person mentioned before, has an HDX 3 system with a bunch of interfaces, and that's fantastic. As you say, they can choose how they use that, but this is going to, as their sessions get bigger, as they start looking at other projects, that flexibility is going to be there to grow even bigger, just provided that they have their software up to date. So I think that's a really nice really nice way to look at it.
Definitely, yeah. Good. Well, I think that takes us to the top of the hour. It's I'm in the UK, so it's early hours of the morning for me. So I think with that, we have one. Should we squeeze in that one last question that sneaked in there? Thanks, Young Eel.
Sure.
Will this system work with older versions of Pro Tools? No. You need to be. This is tied to, or it's a feature of the next release. It's there's an awful lot of development work has gone in to do this. So this is not something that's it's a software feature. So you have to be on this next release of Pro Tools in order to get it. So make sure you're up to date, on plan, and all that stuff. All right. So I think thanks very much for everyone who joined this webinar. It's been very enjoyable running through this with you, and say we're really excited about this. I think we're all kind of having fun playing around with the hybrid engine on our own system. So with that, we will leave you, and Thanks very much for joining, and we'll be doing another one of these when we for the next Pro Tools release. So that'll be in July, so look out for that session as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.